depression. And chapter 18 of Acts, we've kind of been doing an ADD survey of the book of Acts. We've just been pinging off one germane point in each chapter. And chapter 18 stands out because it's short. And it stands out because it's missing a lot of the elements that we just see so many times in the other chapters, like Paul healing blind people, and Paul healing lepers and or lame people, and Paul being able to invoke all kinds of spiritual power. There's none of this bravado. There's none of this strength. There's none of this stuff that has been so prevalent in the book of Acts. And so the question is, what happened in chapter 18? When I talk about a subject like depression, the reality is that we will all have our day. Every day, every dog will have his day, tied on a short leash and wondering, what the meaning of life is. In that regard, our elders are going to be available immediately after the church service just to pray for folks. And I want to kind of preempt that with, don't be embarrassed, don't be ashamed. It may be for you, it may be for people you know, but come up and let the elders pray with you that we can experience God's divine healing in this very, very tender area. Depression. Now, we'll recall that sometimes this works. We'll recall that Paul has been traveling on a journey. Oh no, is this going to be you? All right. We'll recall that Paul's been traveling on a journey. He began in Antioch. He has traveled to Tarsus. And there he went to Lystra. When he hit Lystra, remember that he was beaten. And not only beaten, but he was stoned pretty prolifically in Lystra. And it was a difficult time for him. It was a time where, he was left for dead on a garbage heap. Chances are he was stripped of all of his clothing because they thought he was dead. And in antiquity, when you killed somebody like that, you got the spoils of war, as it were, and threw him out on the garbage heap. From there, he went up to Troas, and remember at Troas, it wasn't easy for him either. And somewhere along life's journey, we create a legend about these apostles. We create a legend about these early Christians, like they were impervious to pain, like they overcame everything for the glory of God. They struggled. They put in due diligence. They prayed. They had a hard go of it. And the reason they did was because they were so compelled that the story about Jesus was real. They were so compelled that people needed to know about God. And they were willing to give up their lives for something. It's really rare for anyone to find anything that they'd give their life up for. And these people were sold. In Troas, Paul interceded with God and asked for direction. Where do we go? We're not being received in this area. From there, he went up to the Neapolis and over to Philippi. Once again in Philippi, they were incarcerated. Once again in Philippi, they were flogged. Once again in Philippi, they were belittled and maimed for the gospel. From there, Paul travels to Thessalonica and then to Berea. And in both of these places, again, they're persecuted. Again, they're chased out of town. And I don't know about you, but I'd start to get a little weary. I don't know about you, but I'd start to grow a little faint of heart. And I know that a lot of us have jobs that are tough. But in the course of a week, don't you like to win one once in a while? I mean, in the course of a week, don't you like to see a little come back your way? And in point of fact, what Paul and what Silas were experiencing was a steady wall of satanic resistance. But what prevailed for them over and over again was that they saw people come to Christ. They saw healings performed. They knew the power of God was busting into this very dark society. From there, they traveled down to Athens, and this was more or less the Christians at the time hiding them, protecting them. They ushered them into Athens, Paul into Athens, so that he wouldn't get killed up in Thessalonica. And while he was there in Athens, remember he tried to preach the gospel, and it just didn't go anywhere. The Athenians were philosophers. They were brilliant. They were arguers. They always believed in their pantheon, and they pitted everything against it. It was a very difficult time for Paul, and he only had a few converts. And then he went to Corinth. And in Corinth is where we are today. Corinth was a major city in this region. One of the reasons it was a major city was because Corinth was a spot where there was a major series of traffic, and there were huge temples. The temple was to Aphrodite, who was the god of sex. So you can imagine what Corinth looked like. It was also a seaport. So it had like it had three different harbors on either side of it. So add sailors to the temple to the goddess of sex, and you kind of got a rough picture of what was going on in Corinth at the time. And this is what Paul was pitted against with the Corinthians. Let's read this together. Paul, now let's stop there just for a second. This again is a tremendous piece of literature that is quickly lost. In antiquity, the Romans were riling up. They were upset over the Jews in Rome who were fighting over Christ. The Jews were having arguments all the time about, if you believe in Jesus, are you still Jewish, or do you turn into something else? And the Jews were trying to say that this is an illicit religion. It's not legal. This is a different thing than us. The Romans were looking at it like, you Jews, you're fighting over your own thing. Do you believe in a Messiah? Yes. Well, do you believe that Jesus was Hebrew? Well, yes. It's your problem. This isn't our problem. And Claudius got so upset over the Jews. They were rioting in the streets about Jesus. He got so upset about it that he threw the Jews out of Rome. For people to argue today that there was historically no Jesus is stupid. It's absolutely without support. Not only is he recorded in the Bible, he's recorded in the Roman history. He's recorded in Roman ledgers. So as we press on, Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he Then Paul left the synagogue. One night the Lord spoke to Paul. Gotcha. Every week I get you. You can turn it. Here we go. Number one, there's three things. One, the problem with pain. Number two, pain is changing you. And number three, restoring your heart. Let's go to number one. The problem with pain. Now, the problem with pain is that when you incur it, and enough of it, it definitely starts to wear you out. In his book, Your Pain Will Change You, David Crosby writes this: you do not get to choose the events that come your way, nor the sorrow that interrupts your life. They will likely surprise you, catching you off guard and unprepared. For the Apostle Paul, 5 times he received 40 lashes. And 40 lashes minus 1 was the prescribed amount of torture that you could apply to the back of a man without killing him. They believed that if you lashed them 40 times, the 40th one would terminate their life. So I suspect experience taught the torturers where to stop. So we have Paul 5 times receiving 39 lashes. Have you any idea what this man's back looks like? I stubbed my toe and I'm hobbling around for a week. I get a paper cut and I'm in agony and I'm in pain. I'll tell you what, If in the end times they ever torture people to find out where others are hiding, don't tell me where you're hiding. I'll tell you right now. They pull out those bamboos. They get one under one fingernail. I'm telling them your name, your address, your email number. Don't trust me with that information because I'm not a big fan of pain. 5 times. 3 times he was beaten with rods. This is a little different than the lash. The lash, of course, is a cat of 9 tails, comes around, sweeps. Sometimes they have a little piece of bone and metal in it. It flails you. Probably not for Paul. In the crucifixion of Jesus, it was a different matter because he was sentenced to death. So they would use metal, little pieces of metal in it because it didn't matter anyway. He didn't need to survive. But when it came to Paul, they obviously were just punishing him. So it would have been a different application. The rod is exactly what it sounds like, a nice whipping rod. Any of you ever have a parent that corrected you with rods? I've heard stories of people who, their dad would simply say, go out and pick your stick and come on back in and you're going to get your whooping. Yeah, my father sometimes was creative, but he always used a belt, far more humane. 3 times with a rod. 1 time, Paul was stoned. He was stoned to death. I don't know how people miss this, but they do. In 2 Corinthians, there's this incredible story about Paul, and he says, I knew a man 14 years ago, whether in the body or in the spirit, I do not know. But this man ascended to the 3rd heaven. He ascended up to paradise. It was an out-of-death experience. 14 years prior to him penning that, he had been in Lystra. 14 years prior to that, they had stoned him to death, so they thought, in Lystra. And the people who stoned him were so convinced he was dead, they threw him out on the garbage heap. I mean, they weren't thinking that he was moaning and groaning. He was dead. And this man survived that. And finally, we've got 3 times he was shipwrecked. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm sensitive to clues. And I just have a question for you. I meet so many Christians today who live in the world of open and shut doors. They live in a world of open and shut doors. Is this God's will? Then the door will be open. And what is an open door? Well, when the door opens, you see like the sun beaming through. You smell the beautiful flowers on the other side of the open door. There's a green pasture. There's like this river flowing through. People don't walk, they fly on the open door side. The open door is this euphoric kind of meadow of happiness and joy. And I'm almost there. It's a wonderful place on the other side of the open door. There are Christians that actually live this way. I've met them. That door was shut. This one's open. Guess what? Sometimes the open door is tough. Sometimes it's hard. Knowing the will of God isn't about open and shut doors. Knowing the will of God is principle-based. It's principle-based. And that means that you stay fascinated with his word, his law, his decree. Sometimes it's hard. 3 times he was shipwrecked and ostensibly swam to shore. He's been in danger of rivers, bandits, Jews, Gentiles. Cities have rose against him. Countries have rose against him. He's been at sea. He's had false brothers, people who said that they loved him. And then, of course, in his letters he writes, well, Demas fell back in love with the world and has deserted me. Kids, I don't know about you, but this euphoric sort of happy-go-lucky apostleship that we ascribe to the 12 isn't reality. It's not reality. He was a man just like we were. There are 3 things that we're going to take a look at. The problem with pain is, number 1, it has a physical toll to it. 2 Corinthians 11:26 describes this. I have labored and I have toiled. I have known hunger and I have known thirst. I've gone without food. I have been cold. And I love the way they say this in the South. You're just going to have to put up with me. And I've been naked you came out of your mother's womb. Naked you're going to die. I love the way they say that in the South. I don't know how they get away with preaching that word, but they do. He had been physically maimed. And that changes you. That changes you. Yeah, I noticed it the other day. I climbed up into a tree stand. And I got up into this tree stand, and I grew up in the tree business. I climbed trees my whole life, and I would just hang out there on one hand, dance around. Trees, height had no whatsoever to me. And I got up in this stand. Rick's not here today, but Rick Boyce took me out hunting, and he has a tree stand. Well, birds weren't landing on the branch that I was perched on. You know, they were looking at me, whoa, that's too small. He had me in this tree stand. I was way up there, and the wind was blowing, and I'm like doing this, and I'm thinking to myself, wow, you know what? I'm getting old. My body has changed. There are parts now where I give them a command, and they return with, was that a suggestion? and the reality is that we've all fallen or twisted or tweaked or rearranged something, and it changes our profile. And that can be depressing. I was thinking to myself, dang, man, I'm losing it a little bit. I've lost a couple yards here. I don't like that. You know, they're going to have to drag this dead body out of this stand. I'm not going to quit. I'm going to stay right here. So I didn't hunt much. The gun was on the side. I was hanging on the tree for an hour. And it was good. It was all good. Next thing, emotional toil. This is one that we don't often take a good look at. I mean, physical, yeah, but the emotional cost of pain. There's something we lose inside. Paul says that he's gone without sleep. Have you done that? Has there been something that encroached into your world and into your life with such intensity that you went without sleep, that you just couldn't find rest? And he says, daily I face the pressure of the concern for the churches. Because where Paul preached the gospel, where these Christians got saved and started their little church, these were the very towns that beat Paul and threw him out. So what fate lays for them? What is going to happen to them? And Paul's interceding and praying, and he just doesn't know. He doesn't know if the light of Christ that he dimly lit on one candle will be snuffed out, or whether or not it'll catch and the churches will prosper. Now, we know on this side of history that where Paul preached the gospel, the churches prospered. But he didn't know that. And so he stayed awake, and he had pressure and concern. The third thing, there's a psychological toll. When depression lines up on people, I see it so oftentimes come in with a physical malaise. Something will happen. I'll see that amped up so that it becomes an emotional toll. And then eventually it moves into a psychological battle. It moves into this realm where Paul says, when he writes his letter back to the Corinthians, he refers to this first adventure, this first time that he's visiting them. And look at the energy that this man has. I came to you in weakness. He'd been beaten in Lystra. He'd been beaten in Thessalonica. He'd been beaten and run out of city after city, and with great fear and with trembling. This is the Paul that you don't see very often. Your pain is changing you. One of the dangers of pain is that when it first hits, we all go to our default button, don't we? When pain strikes, we go to our default button. You know, I want my binky. We go to the fetal position. We go back to what we know is safe. And Paul does this. You know, in this section in the book of Corinthians, in Acts, he says he was a tent maker as they were, and he stayed and he worked with them. When he first went to Corinth, he immediately started in the tent-making industry. Now, that may look like a legitimate bivocational ploy. It may look like that. There's another study in the book of John, chapter 20, another place to look, where the apostle Peter, after the death, resurrection of Jesus, after he denied him 3 times, after he'd last seen the Lord, in John chapter 20, Peter goes back to fishing. he reverts back to his old livelihood of fishing. And he takes the apostles with him. And then Jesus, of course, encounters them from the shore and reorients Peter's life with the three I love yous. Simon Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know I do. That's where that occurred. Well, the fishing was Peter's old lifestyle. The fishing was his safety net, if you will. And so I think that Paul here is changed. He's not as aggressive in Corinth. He's a beaten dog, as it were. He's not going to lay on that rug. He's been maimed. And that happens to us. That happens to us. Sometimes we go back to bad habits. Sometimes we self-medicate. Sometimes we go to things that we know will help and support us because they did or we thought they did in the past. Sometimes we give up on our Jesus. Sometimes it's just too much. Sometimes we can't carry the cross. Sometimes we just don't think that we can make it to the next level. And we revert back to an old lifestyle. Let that be a warning to you. Let it be a warning when you start to see that happen in life. And we revert back to an old methodology. You know, in my previous life, the expression was this: if somebody hurts you a little, you hurt them a lot. You make people pay for their coming at you. And Paul here, the Jews opposed him. They became abusive to him. He shook out his clothes in protest, and he said, "Your blood be on your own heads." Does that sound like a blessing or a curse to you? Huh? Hey, let's just try. Your blood be on. I'm not even going to say it. I don't want to curse you that way. But quite clearly, Paul, in pain and frustration, was not praying for his enemies. The Jesus prayer. You know, if your enemy sins against you, bless them. He didn't bless them. He's lopping heads and taking names because he has reverted back in his pain. Your pain can change you. So how do you restore your soul? In Corinthians, there's a really cool verse, and it's this one. One night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent, for I'm with you. No one is going to attack you or harm you, because I have many people in this city. You know, I want you to turn to the person next to you and tell them, I'm many people. Jeff, I'm many people. You need each other. The body of Christ is made and created to support each other. The only time people get into trouble is when they don't watch Animal Planet. Because on Animal Planet, it clearly shows how you get into trouble. The whole herd is over here drinking water. And the whole herd, when their head is down, they got one or two that are looking around. Who's the one that gets in trouble? Oh, I'm going to go by myself and drink water. It looks so good over here. I'll just step over this crocodile, and I'm going to get right in here, and I'm going to have my water. And I'm watching this stupid animal on Animal Planet, and I'm screaming, "Don't drink the water by yourself, you idiot!" And they're going to stick their head in. Next thing, death spin and gone. Gosh, there's a lesson to be learned there. You're not designed to run it on your own. You're not designed to take it on your own. Even somebody who ostensibly was as independent as Paul still needed this word from God. I've got many people in this city that love you, and they're going to support you, and they're going to stand next to you, and they're going to be cheering you on. I love that vision in Hebrews chapter 11, that even those who have died, the saints around us, are cheering us on. And there's some precious people who've left this building that I want to believe are cheering us on. They're cheering us on. It's not about being alone. You don't have to be alone. God has his people. It takes trust. One more. Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. You got your original charge, and no matter how difficult it becomes, stay on target. You got one little bomb, and you're in the little jet fighter, and you're zipping through. Stay on target, Luke. Stay on target. Don't go, oh, there's a bird. No, stay on target. Stay on target. Oh, there's a squirrel. Stay on target. Remember the call that God placed in your life. He gave you an original vision. He gave you an original hope. There are things that you wanted to become, things that God had purposed in your soul. Don't lose those. Stay on target, and trust me, this world will try to take them. The devil will try to take them, especially if what you do is against his kingdom. Everything will try to take it, but stay on target, because those who are faithful to the end are the ones that God addresses as my good and faithful servants. Number 3, it takes recommitment. You know, if you've been dinged physically, if you've been dinged emotionally, if you've been dinged psychologically, it's not just enough to get the big rah-rah, stay with Jesus. It's not even enough to say that there's people and there's friends around you. There has to be a come to Jesus moment in your soul. There has to be a time where you line up with God, and where you sit apart with God, and where you call out to God, and where you put it back on the line with God, and where you step up with God. And it's easy to miss this verse in Corinthians. So easy. But Paul cuts his hair off after he's completed a vow. That's not what he did before he took the vow. In the Hebrew culture, a Nazirite vow was, I will not touch my hair with a blade because I have made this vow to you, O God. And it's very curious to me that when he is finished in Corinth, when he is leaving Corinth, he cuts his hair. Because Paul had ponied up. Ponytail? Never mind. Paul had ponied up. Paul had made a decision in Corinth. And God had kept that vow, because when he travels next, he's a changed man. And we will see in the weeks ahead some of the dynamics of his new and empowered ministry. This is a healthy posture. Let's read it together. It's from Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 12. But God said to me, therefore, that's not an easy place to get to. Those are not cheap words. Those are words where a man who was incredibly educated, wealthy, had an entire world ahead of him, gave it up for Jesus Christ. It's a man that after he'd made that great price and sacrifice, was beaten down and challenged by the Christian church. Remember his first missionary journey? They had a council, Acts chapter 15 in Jerusalem, and challenged his call to the Gentiles. And not only was it challenged there, this is a man who went on, and every place where he spoke, every place that he tried to do the work of the gospel, he was beaten and downtrodden. When Paul says that when I'm weak, God is strong, those are not cheap words. Those are words that were paid for with the price of his life. And there's integrity in the statement. Integrity that is not a soundbite on the news. This isn't a 5-second quote from your favorite political candidate. This is a lifestyle. When I am weak, the power of God flows through me like never before. And Paul's grateful for what it costs to achieve that goal. Our application today is this. Number 1, pain kills us, but God can use pain to build us back up. Number 2, don't suffer alone. God has his people. And we will have prayer time afterwards. I have counseling. We have all kinds of things. And you got each other. The number 1 best thing in the world is the person sitting next to you. Number 3, our struggle's not against flesh and blood. And you're going to come up against closed doors and open doors, and sometimes the open doors go places that are not God ordained. That's not the best policy in the world. It's rather principle-driven, focused on God's word, and maintains that. Number 4, in God's kingdom, when you're weak, God's presence is strong, and death has no say. Number 5, we're done. God bless you. Thank you for letting me teach you this morning.